When I was 5 years old, I received my first games console. It was a Sega Mega Drive. It transported me to worlds of wonder and challenge, with games like Comic Zone and Earthworm Jim, their colourful landscapes and larger-than-life characters, laying the foundations for my lifelong connection with gaming. As the years passed, I witnessed gaming evolve from mere children's novelty into a true art form, a medium celebrated for storytelling, characters and design, comparable to blockbuster movies and recorded masterpieces. I still hold on to my physical game collection, but in this modern digital age, the landscape is changing. Some modern consoles as well as PCs are forgoing disk drives and moving away from physical media, with the rapid growth of the internet and technological advancements in data storage transforming the way we access games. These technological advancements are great at getting games into the hands of users, but they also pose a threat to the accessibility of media built before this digital age. Recently, the Video Game History Foundation and the Software Preservation Network conducted a study on the availability of classic video games. The results are pretty alarming. Only 13% of video game history spanning from 1960 to 2009 is represented in the current marketplace. This means that nearly 9 out of 10 games from that period are unavailable outside of their original hardware. As these physical formats deteriorate, many obscure titles could fade into mere memories, their data being lost to time. Reflecting on history, we face challenges in understanding periods with limited source material. The further back we go, the sparser our knowledge becomes. Some ancient civilizations are barely known, leaving us to rely on archaeological records and environmental clues. It's tragic to think that gaming, with its global cultural and artistic legacy, may face a similar fate. In 2024, we have the technology to preserve and make accessible the majority of gaming's history. So, how did we get here? Surprisingly, much of the technology needed for preservation doesn't require significant development costs. Emulation of previous generations of hardware has been ongoing for decades. Console developers have even released previous generations of software on modern hardware. The greatest way to really hammer this point home is to give an example which really shows the scale of this issue. If I want to trace the history of even the most successful media franchise in the world, Pokemon, it is very difficult due to the recent shutdown of the DS store. The store made available many of the original Game Boy Pokemon titles, including Red, Blue and Yellow, making these games accessible to anyone who would wish to follow the history of this landmark series. Now, with the store gone, outside of emulation or the potentially costly investment of original hardware, these games essentially are unobtainable in an official capacity. Pokemon. Bigger than Mickey Mouse, Pokemon. I mean, come on. $88 billion in combined sales? More people alive will have seen Nintendo's cheeky yellow electric mouse than nearly any other character on the planet. And yet, it is almost impossible to get hands-on access to how it all began. There are also more modern examples, such as the recent release of Counter-Strike 2. This game was released as a huge update to Counter-Strike Global Offensive, which has replaced near enough all of the content of the original title, making CSGO effectively impossible to play in any real capacity. This is contrary to previous versions of Counter-Strike such as Source and 1.6, which are still playable and maintain a solid player base today. If this method of sequels replacing or overwriting their original versions becomes the norm, there will be countless titles, especially in this day and age of esports and live service games, which will never be available to users again. All those hours and money looking at you, Genshin Impact, are one day going to disappear, and as these free-to-play live service games depend on the game and player base existing to generate revenue, as soon as one of these becomes non-viable for the publisher to maintain, the game's presence and availability will cease, likely forever.
Welcome to the Great Library of Alexandria.
So, is this it? Is this just a case of moving with the times? Games are no longer a permanent thing and we should enjoy the moments they give us, even if they are but fleeting? To a certain extent, yes. As with most types of media, only those that have a real cultural impact are the ones that survive the passage of time. When you go to an art gallery to see a Van Gogh, You're rarely going to see any of his failures or countless works produced on the way to his Sunflowers or The Starry Night, but I believe this was down to the medium and technology of the time. Paintings are often produced on canvas and are sometimes physically impressive pieces of vast scale. Protecting and maintaining such a piece is very difficult, and often damage or mistreatment can ruin a piece for countless generations. We need only look at periods of history in which large amounts of physical work has been lost to see the cultural impact this can have. Think about the loss of the Library of Alexandria, or even more recently the Nazi book burnings in the Second World War. It is unknown how much events like this can set us back as a society, and though we may not actively perceive it, these effects may still be being felt today, decades or even centuries on. This is why I feel so strongly about this issue. We're not trying to store vast amounts of books, statues, or anything else physical. We are fans of a medium which can be easily converted to a digital format, with many games from decades past being mere bytes of data on hard drives which now hold terabytes of information. Regardless of how we've lost pieces of the past before, we now have the ability to adapt and learn from these mistakes and hold on to the history which has impacted global culture in such a pivotal way. Imagine if cinema or music faced a similar situation. Just a hypothetical world in which some of the most groundbreaking films of all time were only accessible during the era that they were made. The history of filmmaking, as well as the impact they've had on everyday life as cultural phenomena, would vanish. Hundreds of classic movies, which not only made cinematic history, but also cultural icons out of those who starred in them, would have had their impact hugely stifled if there was no way to access the original source material. Would people still be quoting classic one-liners such as "I'll be back" or "Game over, man, game over," if these classics could no longer be experienced for the first time by a new generation? There's also the argument for the cult classic film, a movie which in its time may not have been a global blockbuster, but established a fan base over time. If these movies hadn't been accessible years after their cinematic release, then you'd risk the chance that these pieces of media wouldn't be able to find their cultural home. And this scenario becomes ever more likely in gaming as the industry becomes ever more reliant on financial gain as a metric for success. The same goes for music. Kurt Cobain of Nirvana is a pivotal individual when talking about art forms and their legacy. Kurt, who sadly passed away in 1994, has now spent more time dead than alive, and yet year in, year out, countless teens discover his music and status as a generational icon. As long as Nirvana's music continues to be made available to the masses, I don't see this ever changing. If you're wondering why I believe this wholeheartedly, it's because it happened to a 14-year-old me back in 2005. I still listen to Nevermind regularly to this day. These landmarks of cultural and artistic history are not just important to preserve in order to know where we as a species have come from, but they are also the beacons that inspire the future. Without bands like Nirvana, for instance, I would never have been in the many small-time rock bands I was in during the late 2000s. I wouldn't have ever dreamed of releasing an EP during that time. This was understandably only a tiny blip in the grand scheme of the cultural history of humanity, but it was my small blip. And the more contribution there is to the tapestry of art, it encourages others to follow suit, which makes the world a much richer place to be in, as well as enabling the truly magnificent generational talents to pursue their ambitions and be celebrated. The trail of influence is crucial when it comes to the survival and continuation of an art form, and that influence can only exist if we can trace the legacy of those who came before us. While the legacy of Pokemon will inevitably continue because of the franchise's monolithic scale, the more gaming begins to be taken seriously as an art form, it becomes more and more important to preserve and savour where we've come from. Yes, I can pick up the most recent Pokemon game on the Nintendo Switch, but that's akin to me loving the Alien franchise yet only being able to watch Prometheus and Alien Covenant because the original quadrilogy was only released on VHS in the 80s. I could still experience part of the franchise, yes, but would never be able to fully understand the series' evolution, intellectual property, and vision without the context achieved by having complete accessibility to the entire franchise and its history. I believe that as gaming becomes more culturally accepted as an art form, it may be protected in the same way as music and cinema. But the thing is, we need to start now. It's no good starting in 50 years' time once decades of people's hard work and passion has vanished into the ether. Some early video games, which are highly regarded for the creation of much-loved characters, franchises, or even entire genres, are placed on a pedestal as highly as some of these other forms of media when the history of gaming is discussed. Many titles are lauded for their storytelling, location design, and unique mechanics, and yet until this study there has been very little talk about how we access these games for years to come. I know there is the argument that games are able to be remastered or remade, so that new players can experience them on new hardware, doing so without the limitations of technology which may have restricted the developer's vision at the time. However, the same has been a trend in cinema for a while now, and there has rarely been a remake that has topped the original for feel and atmosphere. For example, there have been many remakes of old horror movies using modern technology to up the gore and violence, but many, myself included, feel that the practical effects of old horror movies created on a shoestring budget ooze a passion for filmmaking that CGI cannot compete with. The capturing of lightning in a bottle, if you will. This is very similar to the recent trend in video game remakes, even though some of these remade games, such as Final Fantasy VII or the just released Silent Hill 2, may be incredible games in their own right and technological masterpieces. It's impossible to capture the exact feeling of the original. In fact, being able to access the original versions of remade games is key when exploring the history of a series and comparing the differences between the two. What changes were made from the original title in order to make it fit with a modern gaming audience's expectations? This could recently be seen in the incredible remake of Resident Evil 2. The game had a very similar feel and aesthetic to the original, but many of the mechanics and story beats had been altered to make it more playable and in line with current gaming trends. Regarding the Pokemon example used earlier, the first three games have arguably undergone the remake treatment in the Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee games, although the gameplay differs massively from the original outings. It's also important to note that only games which are massive hits of their generation are likely to get a remake or remaster. Sadly, I'm unlikely to find a remake of the Ren and Stimpy show Stimpy's Invention anytime soon, though on reflection that's probably a good thing. However, access to these poorly received and unpopular games is as important to the complete history of gaming as the shining successes when it comes to gaming's evolution and context. Gaming is still a young art form, and it is important to be able to see the mistakes and flops in order to learn from them, as well as those masterpieces that inspire new generations of developers and coders. In history, we can't form a full picture of an event or period without delving into the more uncomfortable mistakes and negatives. Artistic pursuits are no exception, as these failures can give us an idea of why attempted innovations may have been rejected and not become standard practice in the industry. I also think that, especially in the modern day, the sheer amount of content that exists means that there is an ever-increasing strain on our leisure time. With many having only a few hours, if that, to game in their spare time, we end up with minimal time in the day in which we can look back and reflect on gaming's past. When there are multiple games released from AAA publishers a month, many of which take tens to hundreds of hours to complete, I don't really blame anyone for having the lack of time with which to play these retro games, even if they were available. And that's not even counting the sheer volume of random indie titles that make it onto platforms like Steam daily. This might be one of the unfortunate reasons many developers don't make these older games available. The time, money, and effort needed to make some of these titles run on current platforms just isn't statistically worth it for the potential player base. The attention economy is real, and how many would genuinely go back to play through hours of Commodore 64 games in order to make it commercially viable for these companies? Then there is the general lack of desire to preserve this history purely down to a lack of information or even the thought that it may be of importance. Many people, especially younger audiences whose connection with gaming is only recent, will have little, if any, desire to delve into gaming's history at all. They lack the same pull of nostalgia that many of us boomers have for titles of yore, and so for many, gaming history isn't even something to be considered. Yet organisations like the Video Game History Foundation are shedding light on the issue and working to preserve the medium's history. In 2024, we live in an age where everyone can write, record and share their daily lives, creating an instant global connection. So why, when it comes to gaming, are we at risk of losing such a large portion of a digital medium which is barely half a century old? At the same time, it's important to acknowledge that there are efforts being made in the industry to preserve gaming history. On PC, platforms like GOG or Good Old Games are taking strides in this direction. They provide a haven for classic titles, offering playable versions of many old gems that might have otherwise been lost to time. GOG's dedication to preserving these gaming treasures is commendable. It ensures that newer generations of gamers can experience the magic of titles that shape the industry we know today. This collaborative effort, involving platforms like GOG and dedicated gaming communities, is a beacon of hope for the preservation of gaming history. It's proof that with concerted effort we can protect these digital legacies for generations to come. Either way, if we want this hobby we know and love to be preserved for the long term, we need to act now. Thankfully, there are organisations bringing this issue to the limelight, and they can hopefully make some of these larger publishers realise the value of the accessibility of historic games. At the very least, these organisations are working hard to maintain and preserve the history of the medium, but as we progress further into the digital age, how the data-only titles of the future can be maintained for later generations is a puzzle that is yet to be solved. Remember, a people without knowledge of their past history, origin and culture is like a tree without roots. Thanks ever so much for watching, especially if you've made it this far. A friend of mine suggested that I turn one of my articles into a YouTube video, and well, here it is. If you enjoyed what you saw, please leave a like and subscribe, and if you have any feedback, please leave a comment. I've never edited or put together a video before, so anything that can help me improve going forwards will be a great help to me. Thanks once again, and I'll see you all in the next one.